Greetings, Bonjour and Dinaway Magani Duke. Greetings, my relatives. Dindisi and Dijinikas, Makinak Waju and Dunjiba, Magizi and Dudame. My name is Christine Dindisi McCleve. I am Turtle Mountain Ojibwe and I'm Eagle Clan. And welcome to my dissertation defense. I am going to hand it over to Dr. Michael Koski to get us started. Dr. Koski?
Yeah, thanks, Dindy Z, and thank you for attending, everybody. First of all, we're here, of course, to support Dindy Z and her work and her PhD. She's been with the program now for about 4 years, and her graduate advisory committee is Panakak Agatha John Shields. Dr. Shields is her first of her co-chairs, her primary advisor. I'm a co-chair as a secondary advisor, and I work here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Department of Cross-Cultural Studies, where we have the Indigenous Studies PhD and master's degrees. We also have Dr. Jessica Nielsen with us, who is also a part of the Graduate Advisory Committee. And unfortunately, because he's in a plane over South America right now, unexpectedly, Dr. Kevin Jernigan, who's on the committee, won't be joining us, but will be reviewing this by recording later this evening. We also have Robin Child with us online here. And with that, let me just say a few things about Dindizi. For almost 15 years now, Christine Dindizi McCleve has been working in Indian country at the national level, most recently as the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and prior to that as the communications officer at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. She has a bachelor's degree in communications and a master's degree in leadership, and soon to be a PhD in Indigenous Studies from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Her research is focused, as you'll hear today, on healing historical trauma with traditional plant medicines, and this within an Indigenous context. And so prior to working in nonprofit, she spent 10 years as an operations manager and an HR with an HR consulting firm in Minneapolis, and has lived in Minnesota, the traditional homelands of the Dakota people, for nearly 40 years, and is a proud mother of two. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dindizi.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. I am going to take a moment here to start sharing my screen, which involves a couple of steps here, so bear with me. Okay. Let's see, screen. Yeah, I'm going to do that one. And then I can do this and swap. Okay, now, Dr. Koski, can you confirm you're seeing the slide and not the slide notes?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, well, just burning a whole bushel of sage here trying to get rid of the nervous jitters. But I really appreciate everyone for coming today. Thank you. Welcome to my dissertation defense. My presentation is titled More Than Peyote, Trauma, Healing, and the Politics of Indigenous Cultural Survival in the Age of Psychedelic Colonialism. This is my research for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Indigenous Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge everyone who has helped me with my degree and this research. Chi Miigwech, thank you very much to my committee members and to my advisors who have put in many hours of meetings helping me with my IRB application and reviewing my chapters. Chi Miigwech, thank you to everyone who took the survey, shared or posted about it, and especially to those who took the time to interview or do a focus group with me in person. Chi Miigwech, thank you so much to everyone who has shown an interest in my research, given me words of encouragement along the way, or said a prayer for me, which I know was many. Thank you. It is with tremendous gratitude to all of you who have participated and supported me to this point that I have reached the defense of my PhD dissertation. This research is done in service to the medicine, our traditional ways of life, and the spiritual warriors who protect them, as well as our communities in need, and always for the people, the Anishinaabe, the human beings. It is meant to edify all who listen with open minds and open hearts. And I also want to acknowledge that while I would love to focus solely on the results and impacts of my research, this is an academic defense, and I have to spend a fair amount of time talking about the academic research process, For those eager to hear the implications and meanings of my research results, stay tuned for more presentations, articles, and the full publication of my dissertation in the coming months. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that it's impossible to condense a 200-page dissertation into a couple dozen slides, as it is also difficult to condense 4 years of research and study into a 200-page dissertation. Ergo, it is unfathomable to try and condense a lifetime of experiences and generations of knowledge and wisdom into a single narrative. With that in mind, please extend me your compassion and patience with this colonial process of summarizing how the global history of settler colonialism lives on today through the psychedelic movement and has touched my life and the lives of other Native Americans. I'd like to dedicate this research to my mother, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather who survived colonial assimilation, abuses, Indian boarding schools, and Indian adoption, so that I could exist and thrive and be here today. And to my children, so that they will know generational healing. I love you, Mom, and I love you, Keith Jr. and Mary. My positionality statement, a little bit about who I am and why I decided to do this research. I am a cross-generational survivor of genocidal Indian boarding schools in the United States. And as my grandparents went to these boarding schools, both Catholic run and federal government run, I noticed that this had impacted my life. I went to go do my master's research on Native American spirituality and Christianity, which covered the impacts or covered the history of boarding schools and led me to become the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And as I continued to pursue healing modalities for both myself and other survivors of colonialism through boarding schools and other assimilation tactics, I was reminded that I wrote about peyote in my master's thesis as part of the Native American Church, but I had never practiced with peyote or the Native American Church. And as I started to look into this, I found what was being called the psychedelic renaissance and a whole bunch of science being done on how to use these medicines for healing. And I began to be triggered and found it very ironic that as I was seeking healing for things that had been done through colonization, it seemed to be happening all over again with the psychedelic movement. So here I am. And let's move forward with this. This dissertation examines the intersections of peyote religion, historical trauma, and the emerging psychedelic movement through a critical Indigenous lens. Centering peyote as a sacred medicine and symbolic flashpoint, the study highlights how psychedelic policy, practice, and commercialization perpetuate settler colonial paradigms, threatening Indigenous cultural survival while mainstream narratives frame psychedelics as healing tools. This research emphasizes how such framing often obscures histories of dispossession, cultural appropriation, and epistemic violence. Employing a quasi-mixed methods approach, this study amplifies the voices of tribal citizens across the US, revealing that healing often lies in reclaiming land-based traditions, kinship systems, and Indigenous ways of being, rather than in psychedelic substances alone. Participants expressed significant concerns about peyote access, ecological degradation, colonial frameworks such as the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and the commodification of sacred medicines through the psychedelic renaissance or psychedelic capitalism. The findings underscore peyote healing as inherently political, embedded within struggles over land, law, and cultural survival. This research calls for legal reforms, Indigenous-led conservation efforts, and international protections for sacred knowledge, challenging dominant psychedelic discourses by recentering Indigenous perspectives and asserting that true healing requires justice, cultural revitalization, and dismantling colonial structures shaping the psychedelic landscape. So a little bit of backstory in the introduction of my dissertation is this through line of my master's research and this story of an eagle feather. When I graduated with my master's degree, No one in my family was there to give me an eagle feather for my graduation. And I lived near the Mississippi River, and I saw eagles flying around. So I prayed to the creator and asked for an eagle feather to just fall out of the sky for me. And one day I was walking by my house and I found an eagle feather on the ground, on the sidewalk, just right there in the neighborhood. I thanked the creator for answering my prayers, and I snapped a picture, this picture. This is the eagle feather. And I sent it to my friend, and she goes, "Oh my gosh, that's an adolescent eagle feather. That means you're not done with your education." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm not going to go do my PhD." Well, that was 10 years ago. And you know how that story goes. Here I am. And she was right. The creator had more in mind for this research. So the section about peyote religion in my master's thesis was just the beginning. I had not even met peyote, and I now know that writing about peyote religion and experiencing it are two different things. In my limited knowledge, I can already see that there is a complex landscape of practitioners within and outside the Native American church, as well as the complex political landscape with issues around conservation, cultural survival, and religious freedom. Regarding the adolescent eagle feather telling me I was not done with my research, the through line from my master's thesis to my doctoral dissertation is that peyote religion and the role of religious freedom in advocating for tribal sovereignty, or rather decolonial frameworks of spiritual sovereignty, is a little bit more complex than I wrote about in 2016. Um, my master's showed that while some Native Americans have rejected Christianity in favor of cultural revitalization, some still wholeheartedly embrace Christianity as a spiritual or religious framework, despite forced conversion campaigns in Indian boarding schools. In 2016, I wrote, "Of independent Native Christian churches, peyote religion is the most significant and widespread pan-Indian religion in the 20th century in the United States and Canada. With approximately 250,000 members, the name for the church has developed from its beginnings as the Native American Church to its current name, Native American Church of North America, structured like the Christian church out of both necessity and belief. The peyote religion views the flesh of the peyote cactus as the flesh of God, given to them for communion with the great divine." Before participating in peyote ceremony, I reflected in my earlier thesis on the complex and sometimes uneasy syncretism between Christianity and the peyote religion, where it was noted in my literature review that peyote was given to the Indians just like Christ was given to the white race, and describing peyote as a sacrament, like within the Christian framework. In 2025, I wrote, "When asked about Christian elements in the Native American church ceremonies, survey responses showed 33% affirming Christian influence and 67% denying it, highlighting the variability of perspectives and experiences of the Native American church. Additionally, there were mixed sentiment scores around the question of Christian syncretism in the Native American church. 22% of responses held a positive sentiment, 44% neutral, and 33% negative. Those who accepted Christian elements framed them as part of their tradition, while critics described them as colonial residue." A particularly charged theme emerging from the interviews in the role of religion, especially Christianity, as both a colonizing force and a continued source of spiritual conflict. Another strong theme that emerged echoes earlier research I conducted for my master's, and really highlights this is an ongoing piece for Native Americans that involves healing and decolonization. So the problem that my research addresses is multifaceted. One, I'm concerned with the negative health outcomes that historical trauma has caused in the minds, bodies, and spirits of Indigenous peoples globally who've experienced colonization, forced assimilation, ethnocide, and genocide. Two, I'm interested to see how traditional practices are used to heal the effects of historical trauma. And three, I'm concerned with the colonization and commercialization of cultural traditions, sacred ceremonies, and psychedelic plant medicines by the very same systems that caused historical trauma, which has cultural, political, economic, and spiritual implications for the Indigenous peoples and their ability to heal and thrive. The short story of a long history here is that at one time it was considered a federal offense for American Indian and Alaska Native people to speak their tribal languages, pray in their traditional ways, hold their ancestral ceremonies, or participate in their cultural songs, dances, and gatherings, which led many to lose connection with their ceremonies, languages, and traditions, and others to continue them in secret, guarding them closely from outsiders. The US Indian boarding schools and various church denominations targeted and inflicted assimilation policies upon our most innocent and vulnerable population, our children. The late 1800s were a tragic time when the US Army enforced a federal campaign to kill the buffalo as a tactic of war against the Lakota people. Federal Indian agents forcibly abducted our children into Indian boarding schools, and the ghost dance spiritual revival movement led to the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. The deep sense of loss from these genocidal events remains with individuals today as historical trauma and unresolved grief, which I will define in a few slides here. While American Indian and Alaska Native people may be leading in negative statistics and dealing with the unprecedented historical trauma, I want to acknowledge that deficit discourse is a product of colonial impacts and measurements. Despite our economic, health, and educational disparities, we are some of the most resilient people on the planet. We have survived attempted genocide and, in some cases, cultural genocide, and we persist. We have retained our ancient millennia-old knowledge and survival and connection. We have remembered our original instructions on how to be a human being. We have not just survived attempted ethnocide and genocide, but we are thriving in modernity. Additionally, part of the problem in the commodification of these plant medicines, or so-called psychedelics, is also connected to academia, Western science, and European ethnocentrism. Many who are taking part in the current psychedelic renaissance are not educated about the harms of cultural appropriation and do not respect Indigenous ceremonies and culture. My research provides a critical counter-narrative to the proliferation of commercial shamans and the harmful extraction of sacred cultural knowledge. Enter the so-called psychedelic renaissance. The second problem that my research aims to address is the ongoing colonization within the psychedelic movement, which is a resurgence of psychedelic science that started in the mid-20th century. And I know I'm running a little bit behind on my little schedule, so I'm going to pass through this a little bit more quickly. This introductory chapter sets the stage by situating peyote within its historical and cultural context. Peyote religion is not simply a therapeutic modality, it's a spiritual practice rooted in resistance, survival, and indigenous sovereignty. Some of the issues that we see going on in the psychedelic movement is that there is a current surge of psychedelic legislation, which either aims to legalize some of these medicines like peyote, mescaline, mushrooms, ayahuasca, and iboga, which are medicines from indigenous cultures all over the world. Some of them just seek to decriminalize them. So instead of creating a legal regulated framework, they just want them to be a low priority or not enforceable by police. And this is happening on citywide efforts, state legislation, and there are efforts to change things at the federal level regarding some of these substances being Schedule I or illegal substances. So, excuse me, I'm getting over a little cold. The psychedelic sector, which has evolved from both the scientific studies, which are leading to chemical compounds being patented by pharmaceutical companies, or psychedelic assisted therapy, which creates a market for people to both buy the medicine and sell it in a certain kind of setting, whether, again, it's regulated or decriminalized. The psychedelic sector is projected to be $3.3 billion annually by 2030, according to Forbes. And this is up from $2.2 billion just a couple of years ago from the same projections. This is resulting in what they call bioprospecting or biopiracy. It involves cultural and intellectual property rights. This is, in the science part of it, academic imperialism, in some of the programs that are being created, cultural misappropriation. There's a lot of people visiting, there's cultural tourism, people visiting other countries, spending time with indigenous peoples, and then coming back a shaman. So there's a lot of harm being done, not to mention the commercialization, commodification of the sacred. And we know from the example of sacred tobacco, how that went when they commercialized and commodified our sacred medicines. So there's a lot at play with that. And this research project is meant to look at all of that. So I designed this mixed method study, wanted to provide a current in-depth analysis of healing knowledge, perspectives, conservation issues. Yeah, I bit off a lot, and I know you'll see I wasn't able to really chew it all. Yeah, I'll get to that later. But I originally had these 3 research questions because I was trying to keep it all consolidated. What are the current Native American needs, practices, and priorities around spiritual healing, mental health, and well-being? 2, what is the current landscape of perspectives and concerns for members of the Native American Church regarding peyote and religious freedom? And 3, what do Native Americans know about the psychedelic movement, and what are their attitudes, opinions, and concerns about it? These questions later evolved during my research process. So I'll revisit those questions when we get to the analysis section, because I had to break them apart. There was so much data to look at. Okay, so the literature review. Again, I won't be able to go totally in depth, and I've already covered a little this in the introduction, but when we talk about the impacts of colonization and historical unresolved grief, there are some references here, namely Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who coined the term historical trauma, which means the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. Later work by Armenta, Whitbeck, and Hebecker developed a historical loss scale, which was a standardized measure that assesses the frequency with which Indigenous individuals think about losses to their culture, land, and people as a result of European colonization. So I did also cover in my literature review the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was a longitudinal study in 1998, which established a clear link between childhood trauma and lifelong physical and mental health outcomes. Children who experience 4 or more of the 10 adverse experiences, such as abuse, neglect, or parental mental illness, were significantly more likely to suffer from chronic illnesses, addiction, and premature death. These findings underscore how disrupted developmental milestones caused by colonization or childhood traumas such as boarding schools may impact Indigenous health outcomes today. Trauma's effects were also passed on biologically. Dr. Rachel Yehuda found reduced cortisol levels in descendants of Holocaust survivors, showing a biological transfer of trauma called epigenetics. And what I found, basically because I have an ACEs score of 10 out of 10, is that the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistics Manual that therapists use, does not actually have a diagnosis for historical trauma. It also doesn't have a diagnosis for complex trauma, which would be multiple types of trauma like childhood trauma, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and historical trauma, just layers and layers of trauma, not to mention epigenetic and generational trauma. So what I found was this study that looked at, it was a 2020 study by Henderson and Ginty, that historical trauma and social, this was the name of the study, historical trauma and social support as predictors of psychological stress responses in American Indian adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. Using Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart's definition of historical trauma, the study identifies depression, anxiety, psychological stress, and childhood trauma as key components of historical trauma, and examines how historical trauma predicts stress responses during the COVID-19 pandemic, and finds that historical trauma contributes to mental health disparities among Native Americans, while social support reduces stress responses. So that's just one piece of the literature review kind of examining how our historical trauma is playing out, and how current Western therapeutic models don't really meet the needs to treat the conditions that we're dealing with. Regarding Indigenous knowledge of healing medicines, which includes all varieties of plants, not just psychoactive ones, Weatherford, 1988, said, regarding the colonization of Indigenous medicines, From the very first contact between the old and the new world, European doctors recognized that the Indians held the key to the world's most sophisticated pharmacy. Medicine in most of the world at that time had not yet risen far above witchcraft and alchemy. The Indians of America had refined a complex set of active drugs that produced psychological and not merely physiological effects in the patient. This cornucopia of new pharmaceutical agents became the basis for modern medicine and pharmacology. Building on Weatherford's framing, it's important to position Indigenous knowledge of plant-based healing not simply as ethnobotany, but as Indigenous biotechnology. Indigenous biotechnology can be defined as the sophisticated place-based systems of cultivation, preparation, and application of plant and natural medicines developed and refined by Indigenous people over millennia. Unlike Western biotechnology, which often isolates compounds for their pharmaceutical development, Indigenous biotechnology is relational, holistic, and deeply embedded in cultural, spiritual, and ecological contexts. It includes selective breeding, fermentation, ceremonial preparation, and ecological stewardship, and spiritual protocols that are transferred through generations via oral tradition, apprenticeship, and community practice. And these are what we call biocultures. Biocultures are integrated systems in which biological and cultural diversity are co-produced, co-evolved, and interdependent. The Indigenous context of biocultures refer to the deep interrelationship between ecosystems, rituals, stories, and lifeways that have emerged in relationship with specific territories and their more than human relatives. Interestingly, within this context, Western medicine has consistently and historically borrowed or stolen Indigenous people's knowledge, rarely giving proper credit or intellectual property rights, while at the same time missing the cultural context and protocols necessary to use the medicine safely. As I mentioned, tobacco is an example of this. And what we have today is the biopiracy, where they are basically stealing Indigenous biotechnology. And this is what is called psychedelic capitalism or psychedelic colonialism. So some of those terms just kind of defined. I already talked about the biocultures. Biopiracy is the unauthorized use, exploitation, or patenting of biological materials and traditional knowledge, often derived from Indigenous communities by external actors, typically without adequate compensation or acknowledgement. Neocolonialism, the persistence of colonial systems of power and control in the post-colonial era, whereby Indigenous peoples continue to face dispossession, cultural appropriation, and epistemic violence through institutions, research, and global industries that claim to support healing or progress. These mechanisms often reproduce colonial hierarchies. And there's even an argument in my dissertation about, there's an argument amongst academics about if we're even in a post-colonial era, because it seems to be ongoing. So it never ends. We can't be post-colonial because it's still going. Psychedelic capitalism, the commodification of Indigenous sacred medicines and ceremonial knowledge within traditional capitalist frameworks, transferring collective land-based healing practices into individualized market-driven products that perpetuate historical trauma and cultural dispossession. Psychedelic colonialism, the contemporary misappropriation of Indigenous sacred medicines and ceremonies by Western actors rooted in settler colonial patterns of land, resource, and cultural extraction that continue to perpetuate historical trauma under the guise of healing. And psychedelic settlerism, a phenomenon in which non-Indigenous individuals and institutions engage with sacred plant medicines and Indigenous ceremonial practices while ignoring settler colonial histories and power structures that have enabled such accents. You know, we got to have a few different ways to say it just so that everybody, you know, including the ones in the back, can really hear it and understand what we're trying to say. I also did a review of international legal frameworks, which again, I don't have time to get all, you know, in depth with you, but there was a review of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, which is a direct result of the fact that the policies that set us up for Indian boarding schools actually prohibited our religious practices, thereby requiring us to have a specific act instead of having our religious freedom under the Constitution like everyone else. because at one time we weren't even citizens of the United States. So the Religious Freedom Act of 1978 was then amended in 1994 to have specific language around the use of peyote. There's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which a few of the articles address how we have the right to access our traditional medicines and the right to be healthy. Cultural and intellectual property rights vary, and there's also an examination of these various laws, including the rights of nature, which in 2012 Bolivia enacted a framework for the law of Mother Earth, which gave nature these rights as a person to be defended in court. And several tribes and other nations have also enacted rights of nature, or in White Earth Nation, they have the rights of Manuman, which is wild rice. The World Intellectual Property Organization at the United Nations last year in 2024 adopted a treaty on intellectual property, genetic resources, and associated traditional knowledge, again, trying to provide some international guidelines for the protection of these cultural heritage and biocultures. However, with a lot of these international legal frameworks, unless they are codified into either a state or a statehood, like a nation's laws, they're just guidelines. So that's the rub there, which makes them, useful but not practical, as well as the Nagoya Protocol, which is also from the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which says that there should be an agreement. The protocol is to implement basically a contract between Indigenous peoples and somebody who wants to utilize their genetic resources. The protocol establishes the requirement for prior informed consent, which isn't happening in a lot of these situations, and mutually agreed upon terms before accessing genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. It also talks about benefit sharing. So say, for example, I know my research is about peyote, but with psilocybin mushrooms, which are now legalized in Colorado and Oregon, if the Mazatec tribe who traditionally used the mushrooms would have to give consent and permission for somebody to use them, and then or to patent them or create a product around them. And then there would be benefit sharing, which means that the Mazatec would either be paid a percentage or they would get some kind of fair trade for their genetic resources. So moving into the methodology, how did I do this research? The dissertation really seeks to decolonize the academy. That's one thing I really appreciated about the Indigenous Studies program at University of Alaska Fairbanks, which, by the way, was the only Indigenous Studies PhD in the US. I didn't want my PhD to be in American Indian Studies because we predate the concept of America. So it's important to me that this is an Indigenous Studies degree. This chapter outlines the decolonial, Indigenous, and mixed methods approach that guided the design and execution of my research, and prioritized relational accountability, community relevance, and cultural coherence, challenging the dominance of Western scientific paradigms in academic research and reframing validity through Indigenous frameworks. My research paradigm is rooted in Indigenous methodologies, as articulated by scholars like Sean Wilson, Linda Tuhi Y. Smith, and Margaret Kovach, as well as Leanne Simpson. These methodologies emphasize that knowledge is relational and co-constructed, research is ceremony, and the researcher is accountable to community, ancestors, land, and spirit, not just to academia. And validity is based on trust, reciprocity, and respect. So I did look at different ways to structure my research, including descriptive and interpretive findings from Indigenous knowledge production, and two-eyed seeing, which is a methodological approach that honors both Indigenous and Western lenses, using qualitative data descriptively and quantitative data thematically. Sorry, reverse that. Quantitative data descriptively and qualitative data thematically. This dual approach reflects a commitment to balance. And that is, so I put all these words up here because they were just kind of, it was hard to summarize my dissertation. Like I said, it was 200 pages. So these were some of the words that were listed in my methodology. And at the bottom, the 6 R's of Indigenous research have guided my research design all along, which are respect, relationship, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, and representation, which is really important in Indigenous communities, that that we show respect for all of our relationships, that there be a relationship, that it's not, that the research is not extractive, that there be a relevance to the people who are participating, and that there be reciprocity involved. Although I didn't get funding to pay participants for my research, my acts of reciprocity are to share this research, to publish the dissertation freely and with open access, and to continue to work with Native communities in advocating for the protection of our sacred medicines and our traditional ways of life. And that is my responsibility that I carry. And I will continue to advocate for Indigenous representation in these psychedelic spaces as also a way of reciprocity for those who shared knowledge with me through this research. The theoretical frameworks that I used, as I mentioned, two-eyed seeing, which is weaving Indigenous and Western worldviews while preserving the integrity of each. Mino Bimadwizin is Anishinaabe for the good life, and that is living in right relationship, a unifying and transcending concept that when activated contains the past, present, and future, to have good and respectful approaches to life, which includes Indigenous research. And that was another thing in terms of my auto-ethno biography aspect, which I forgot to mention on the previous slide. Auto-ethnobiography is the acknowledging the fact that I, as a researcher, am not 100% objective, but that as a Native person who has sat in ceremony with peyote, that I have a more of a connection to my research. And in this way of incorporating Mino Bamadazuin Anishinaabe cultural framework, this blending of past and present is, what I alluded to in the beginning, in that there is really a different way of looking at not only our worldview and our cosmology, but time and our connection to our ancestors and to future generations. And in that way, time is not as linear as Western constructs would describe it. Another Indigenous theoretical framework that I used is research as ceremony. As we contextualize Indigenous research methods, we recognize that Indigenous knowledge is contingent upon relationships. Our ontology is answerable to more than one being, and so it is answerable to all our relations. And I just have to say, these were really hard to hold, while also the two-eyed seeing, like, I think I need more than 2 eyes, like just like I need more than 2 hands. Like, this was really difficult to hold both the Western and the Indigenous frameworks, because as this is a degree in an academic institution and I'm going through these academic protocols, it was really hard to try and go back and forth and make sure that there really was integration between the two. So if you know any other Indigenous scholars, and to all you Indigenous scholars listening, thank you. Your work is appreciated. So how my research questions evolved when I started to get into my data collection as I was developing my survey. I just kind of naturally created these sections within the survey to, guide the participant through the questions. I created these 5 categories, and then when I started to collect the data, it just naturally followed through that the data was, in these certain categories. And so I broke my questions into 5 instead of 3, which also helped me with the analysis, to break it off into smaller chunks. So it ended up being, what are tribal citizens focused on for health and well-being, and what are their traditional and non-traditional practices? What are tribal citizens' concerns about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act regarding peyote? What is the relationship between peyote practitioners and the Native American Church? What are tribal citizens' concerns regarding peyote conservation amidst the psychedelic movement? And what do tribal citizens know about the psychedelic movement, and what are their opinions or concerns about psychedelic legislation and decriminalization? My data collection methods included a quantitative survey, which was distributed via SurveyMonkey. I got 50 total responses. Had qualitative interviews conducted with 13 tribal citizens across multiple regions. I tried for 2 focus groups, but I only got 1. That was with 6 participants from peyote traditions. And then I observed several public meetings where I took field notes, and those were the following. At the National Congress of American Indians in Las Vegas, Nevada in October, I attended a panel called Indigenous Diplomacy, the Indigenous People's Guide to the United Nations and WIPO's new treaty on genetic resources and traditional knowledge. I attended also at NCAI that October Peyote Task Force meeting. Oh, sorry, these dates should be 2024, as we have not yet reached October of 2025. My apologies. I also attended at NCAI Bridging Worldviews, which was a session focusing on Indigenous perspectives at the United States Patent and Trademark Office and their engagement with WIPO. Then I went to Washington, D.C. in November and attended the American Indian Religious Freedom Summit, celebrating the 35th anniversary of the amendment to AIRFA, which was hosted by the Native American Church of North America. All data collection was guided by community protocols, cultural ethics, and informed consent. Sensitive ceremonial information was respected and protected. So if survey, focus group, or interview participants shared things that were what I deemed as sensitive cultural knowledge, I eliminated it from the transcript before my analysis. And this is the really wonderful visual of everywhere that I went. So last summer, my field research began with my qualitative interviews and a focus group in Colorado. I got in my camper trailer in my vehicle and started out here from Minnesota and drove down to Colorado and through Arizona and California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and South Dakota on my way back to Minnesota. That took about 2 months, 5,400 miles, and a lot of driving. And then I flew to Anchorage, Alaska, where I conducted a few more interviews and did outreach for the survey. And I flew to New York for a focus group, which didn't end up happening. And then lastly, I flew to meetings in Nevada for the National Congress of American Indians, which it looks like there's this big gap here in terms of like the South and Southeast part of the country. But the meeting in Las Vegas did include tribes from Oklahoma and these other territories. And then, of course, the meetings in Washington, D.C., which were also intertribal. So I had when I earlier I said quasi-mixed methods, it's because what I wanted to do was real mixed methods so that there would be academic validation by the academy through these, quantitative scientific methods. But I didn't take a statistics class, so I ended up not actually doing some of the more rigorous statistical testing. But the survey did give me quantitative data. I just haven't been able to work with it sufficiently to call this mixed method. So I'm calling it a qualitative study with quantitative data. And I did a thematic analysis using constructivist grounded theory. And so we're calling it like a convergent mixed methods design, where I integrated the qualitative and quantitative data to provide a comprehensive understanding of Indigenous experiences and perspectives on peyote use. Grounded theory allows for themes to emerge organically, reflecting the stories and relationship of participants rather than imposing external categories. I did also, like I said, include autoethnography and my positionality. My personal experiences shaped by lived connection to peyote community relationships and cultural teachings were woven into the analysis. The qualitative data in this study were analyzed with the grounded theory approach and the 6-phase thematic analysis process by Brunn and Clark, which, okay, I'll read that in a second, which first I recorded the interviews and focus group, and then had them transcribed using Dragon software, and then uploaded them into Atlas TI, which is a coding software, so that I could go through the transcripts and start to identify labels or codes of what was being shared, which then allows themes to be identified from the data, rather than scientific testing of a predetermined hypothesis, because my hypotheses, as I'll talk about in a few slides, weren't really able to be tested. But I do think they are supported by the qualitative data. So this approach is especially compatible with Indigenous methodologies, as it honors the stories and knowledge of participants as sources of valid theory. I began transcribing the interviews using Dragon software, and then carefully reviewed them to correct errors and remove culturally sensitive information. The clean transcripts were uploaded for structured analysis. First, I immersed myself in the data through repeated readings. Then I generated the initial codes from the participant language in the transcripts. I grouped the codes into potential themes and reviewed and refined these themes for coherence and distinctiveness. It was at this point that I also started to combine them with the quantitative data from the survey to further enhance the thematic analysis, and then started naming and defining themes based on cultural relevance and conceptual clarity, writing the final analysis that integrated all the interpretations and participant quotes from multiple data streams, which I depicted here as an integrated mixed method data analysis, since I was trying to describe it as I have qualitative data and I have quantitative data, and I'm doing this mixed methods, but it actually was more of an integrated approach. So this slide is kind of aimed at how it didn't really meet the standards for quantitative statistical analysis. There were multiple data streams integrated. There was some survey software analysis. So I used SurveyMonkey. I used an actual upgraded version of SurveyMonkey, the Premier plan, which enabled advanced features such as unlimited questions and responses, skip logic, data exports, sentiment analysis, and a customizable white label URL. These features were essential for collecting nuanced responses from participants representing diverse tribal affiliations, ceremonial roles, and perspectives on the current psychedelic landscape. And I had both closed and open-ended questions, so it wasn't technically all just quantitative data. With the open-ended questions, it was more qualitative. But it was designed to capture demographic data, as well as participants' attitudes, beliefs, and concerns regarding peyote, religious freedom, and the psychedelic movement. I also used cross-tabulation and triangulation, as I mentioned, looking at the quantitative and the qualitative data separately and then combined, and using that to compare and contrast with the different data sets. I looked at response patterns that emerged from those themes and used descriptive analysis, but there were no inferential statistics, in other words, t-test, chi-square, or regressions that were actually applied. Now we get to the results. Woohoo! We're finally getting to the results. This chapter is about the results, but I also continue to discuss the analysis and how I achieved these research results. So here's an example of the data analysis using the coded theme traditional practices, specifically within the context of the research question on health and well-being. As you can see here, I had the codes in each category pertaining to my research questions. So these are just examples. There were more codes than this, of course, but if you notice, traditional practices shows up in multiple categories, and this is how many times it showed up in each of the categories. So these are what I call co-occurring codes because they co-occur in different categories. So once I identified a high frequency code, such as this one that I'm using for the example of traditional practices, I started to look at what data those codes and labels were attached to determine what types of practices participants were referring to. So again, for this example, I'm focusing on health practices and the code traditional practices. So you can see how I took the data coded information from the interviews shown in the blue arrows here. Participants talked about the various types of traditional practices that they used for health and healing, such as praying, making offerings, smudging, and participating in cultural activities. There was actually discussion about what the word praying meant to them because some of them didn't necessarily like that term, as it was one of my options in the questions in the drop down, and they were like, well, I don't necessarily call it praying. So there's a whole discussion about that. While some described engaging with Western wellness strategies such as counseling or prescribed medications, the overwhelming pattern emphasized that indigenous approaches to healing were more prevalent. Participants consistently mentioned activities such as attending Native American church ceremonies, smudging, making offerings, and participating in other cultural practices in lieu of engaging with clinical therapies or pharmaceutical interventions. So then I combine that with the data from the survey under the question, what is needed for healing, under the health practices section of the survey shown in the pink arrows here. The survey data showed specifically what people needed for healing and what percentage of the survey participants said they needed different things. Some insightful findings from the qualitative data was the universal call for cultural revitalization, even among those who do not use peyote, and this constitutes a significant finding, but not significant in terms of scientific testing or statistics. It's just culturally significant. So this, some of the participants said healing comes from going back to our ways, not just peyote, our food, our songs, our ways of being. This belief was echoed in the quantitative data with responses to what is needed for healing. 24% said community, 15% said ceremonies, 15% said connection, and 12% said traditional foods. So this suggests that peyote is not the cornerstone of healing. Rather, the emphasis is on reconnecting with cultural traditions, whether that involves plant medicines or not. When I asked what their communities were healing from, quantitative data showed emphasis on both personal and collective trauma. 50% said their communities healing from trauma, 45% said from addiction, 31% said from various forms of abuse, 25% said historical trauma specifically, and 9% boarding school impacts. After analyzing the interview and the survey data, I synthesized or combined the data to gain additional insights shown in the purple arrows here. Using the two-eyed seeing and historical context approach and framework, I was able to infer that all of these were impacted by the suppression of indigenous knowledge, epistemicides of modernity in Western colonial contexts. The consistency across responses, both narrative and numerical, illustrates that cultural engagement itself is healing, not merely a supplement to medical intervention. One participant said, healing comes from going back to our ways. Just a high-level overview of the themes that emerged from the research questions here. Again, this is basically, these are like the headings for my whole results chapter, so I won't have time to get in depth with all of these. But this is kind of how things emerged from the categories and themes that or the categories for the coding to the themes that developed. Again, focusing on health practices. A theme that developed was what tribal members are healing from versus what they're healing with. And then out of that came the insights about spiritual sovereignty, religious autonomy, and cultural survival. And so, again, I don't really have time to get into all of those results. Some of the final themes emerging from the data make it clear that healing is political, as acts of resistance to colonization. Participants called for policy changes in healthcare and education and justice systems. Some of the key findings were the recurring triggers from the deeper impacts of historical trauma. Preserving peyote is not just about saving a plant, it's about protecting a way of life. There's healing tied primarily to the reclamation of indigenous traditions, land-based practices, and kinship. And that healing is not dependent solely on psychedelic substances, and Western systems treat symptoms. Other key findings, I'm sorry, was that yep, that's a duplicate. Sorry, I thought I deleted that. One respondent said that scientists warned that at the current rate of legal harvest, peyote might not survive for 7 future generations, a devastating prospect that triggers collective fears among participants. These anxieties reflect more than ecological concern. They also speak to the deep cultural and spiritual connection Native practitioners have with the medicine. Participants explain that peyote is not merely a substance, it is understood to be a living relative, a sacred being with a spirit. As one participant shared, peyote has the power to heal ailments, mend broken families, and answer deep spiritual and emotional questions. Losing access to this medicine is seen as losing a relative and yet another vital piece of indigenous cultural ways of life. The data suggests that peyote is not just the cornerstone of healing, but rather the emphasis is on reconnecting with cultural traditions, whether that involves the plant medicine or not. My hypotheses that I'll just read I'll read what I think came out of it. The data strongly support the hypothesis that the psychedelic movement is perpetuating historical trauma by replicating settler colonial paradigms and appropriating indigenous healing frameworks. This seemed very clear from the responses that I got. This research affirms that true healing is not derived by plant compounds alone, but from the cultural, relational, and spiritual frameworks within which they are traditionally held and practiced. This is really important for the psychedelic movement, people like followers and leaders of the movement, to understand that it's not just the medicine, it's the actual cultural framework that comes with the medicine that heals. So a few models that I created. One is psychedelic colonialism and the perpetuation of historical trauma, based on my hypothesis that the psychedelic movement is perpetuating this historical trauma, appropriating psychedelic plant medicines, commodifying sacred traditions, and re-traumatizing the communities from which these healing practices originate. And the second model is an indigenous healing framework, which focuses on healing not just being in these medicines, but in the cultural frameworks, the values, the cosmologies, and the relationships which make these practices truly transformative. And I'll just go back to this quote from a participant, or no, I'm sorry, I wrote this. In the age of psychedelic colonialism, genuine healing will not be found in laboratories or courtrooms, but in the living traditions, sovereign ceremonies, and enduring spirit of indigenous survival. The adoption of narrow definition of the term plant medicine by the psychedelic movement is an example of the appropriation of indigenous knowledge without fully understanding its wisdom. So the conclusion and recommendations, some benefits and outcomes. I believe that this research will help with, I do believe that it helped increase the awareness of the psychedelic movement among participants who weren't previously aware, which was actually a good number. And of course, I didn't put that in my slides here, but there is an actual percentage of participants that didn't know what the psychedelic movement was. This should also help increase awareness around cultural survival as healing, increase knowledge of the issues surrounding peyote and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And I plan to be disseminating quite a few educational tools for tribes to engage with the psychedelic legislation efforts that are happening nationally and at state levels. some of the limitations of my study and further research that I think needs to happen. Limitations were the thematic analysis through data coding was an imperfect process. In fact, it was really difficult and quite laborious. I had like over 1,000 codes, data labels to work with, and that was really hard and overwhelming. My ambitious nature, the study did not, it was just too much. I really, I didn't want to leave anything out, you know, because everything's connected and related and contextual, and it was just a lot that it ended up, my study design did not meet the academic standards of mixed methods according to scientific definitions. And I had a goal of 100 survey responses, which was not met. I only got 50. And only 4 of those 50 survey responses answered the questions about the Native American Church and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which I believe was an error in my survey design, because had I had the survey designed to say, if you're not a member of the Native American Church, that it was use skip logic to skip that whole section. So I think some people said no, they weren't a member, and then just skipped all those questions. So I think further research that could be done, more examination of the religious definitions, legal freedoms, and the shifting nature of religion, since that's really of interest to me here, with the historical context of forced conversion in boarding schools, a lot of Native people who still practice Christianity as well as traditional ways. And now the psychedelic movement is full of new churches that don't necessarily adhere to Judeo-Christian frameworks. And so they are also using religious freedom to practice with indigenous medicines, when just 100 years ago in this country, it was, you know, hedonism, it was illegal for us. And so this is a piece of reckoning that I think we need to look at. I think there needs to be further analysis of the mescaline versus peyote issue, which I didn't even get into with my slides, but was a big portion of my questions and my results, was asking people about the cultivation of peyote in its natural habitat, the synthetic reproduction of mescaline, if that could help with the endangerment of peyote. And it's really a controversial question. The answers were completely varied and there is no agreement. So I think further research is needed there. Also, further explanation of the beyond human consciousness and access to spiritual realms. I didn't even get to touch on any of that. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the indigenous knowledge that we have with these medicines that Western science does not seem able to broach or explain, as well as policy advocacy for the rights of nature and protection of indigenous biotechnology going forward. So my conclusions really, like, this is the duality of peyote healing as a political act. I believe this dissertation has a few contributions to several bodies of knowledge, indigenous research and epistemologies, advancing relational and ceremonial methods of inquiry, reaffirming that indigenous knowledge systems are valid, rigorous, and essential. It adds to the growing literature on intergenerational grief and historical trauma, as well as resilience, and showing how healing is embedded in cultural and spiritual practices. Religious freedom and policy, it critiques the limitations of ERFA and calls for stronger protections that reflect indigenous definitions of spirituality and cultural sovereignty. As well as contributing to psychedelic studies. It challenges the field to reckon with its colonial roots and make space for indigenous leadership, not just inclusion, but control. Regarding policy and practice recommendations, there need to be legal reforms, indigenous-led conservation, narrative change, protocols and consent using Nagoya protocols and benefit sharing, as well as the investment in indigenous healing initiatives. So the implications and my calls to action are to recenter indigenous leadership and knowledge in psychedelic policy and research, and that true healing is inseparable from justice, cultural revitalization, and the dismantling of colonialism. Miigwech, Guyana, thank you. Here's my contact info, and whew, I made it. Oh my gosh, it's been exactly 1 hour. So I will now stop sharing and open it up for Q&A, which we have on the webinar here. You can, if you're in the audience, go to at the bottom, you'll see the little Q&A for questions and answers. Go ahead and type your questions in there and I can answer your questions. And then after a short amount of time of Q&A with all of you all, thank you for attending and listening. Then we're going to end the public webinar and move into the academic defense section with my committee members, which I'm too nervous to have you all listen in for that. So it's going to be private. But it looks like we don't have any questions yet. I know it's a lot, and I didn't even cover a lot of it. All right. So, also for those, you can choose to have your question come in anonymously too, if you want to stay anonymous. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for those kind words. And yes, I look forward to finalizing my dissertation, which is still going through a couple edits, and then will be hopefully turned into the university this summer when I graduate, and then I can publish it and share it, and all my nerdy friends can read all 200 pages of it.
And DDC, very good job, and congratulations on getting the presentation out. And I just want to say that it's perfectly okay if committee members would like to ask a question. Of course, we'll save most of ours for the closed session, but that might help to get some other questions going. So, DDC, what I would ask you to talk a little bit here more in the public forum is to say a little bit more about the education and policy tools that have emerged from this work. How can you take what has been done here and learned here and turn it into, practical everyday knowledge for people to, develop academic and public policy from?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So really those are two different sections of what my recommendations would be. On the policy side, yeah, I didn't really get to get into what the results said, but one interesting thing that I found was at the Religious Freedom Summit in Washington, D.C., they had Suzanne Harjo was there as a public speaker, and she was actually involved with the amendments that were implemented 35 years ago. And she said that when they were working on ERFA and the amendments, that it was always meant to be a policy guideline, and that it needed to be further enforced. And so that was one of the common pieces of feedback that participants had, was that ERFA was really just a regulatory framework that basically said, like, all these rules about you have to be a member of a tribal nation, you have to be a member of a Native American church, and you have to have these pieces of paper, and then you have to get the peyote through these people who are certified by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, which is a federal agency, and that it was just all these regulatory pieces of framework, and that there was really no enforcement to the law, and that it was lacking a lot of guidelines with some of these questions that are coming up in terms of states legalizing the use or decriminalizing the use of peyote or mescaline, and that really some of the participants, not all of them, felt like ERFA needed to be updated, and that there needed to be pieces added for the enforcement, as well as there's some advocacy happening to add some appropriations from the federal government to help with peyote conservation. So there's a bunch of other issues around conservation regarding peyote's habitat and the protection of it, because where it grows in the southwest corner of Texas, most of where peyote grows in the US are privately held lands. And so there's all kinds of issues. There were so many very detailed nuances, but there is some information that I feel like could be beneficial to be shared publicly to help inform policy recommendations and ongoing advocacy around American Indian Religious Freedom Act and protection of peyote.
Thanks for that, Dindusi. If other committee members have a question they'd like to ask in the public area here, please go ahead. I do see an anonymous attendee asked if you're optimistic or not. Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. You know, that's a hard one. I think I tend towards optimism in general. Um, I don't think I would be here without being optimistic. I wouldn't have attempted to do this research if I didn't think it was going to make a difference. Um, that being said, the things that I see happening, the numerous challenges that participants talked about in regards to just trying to pursue their own health and well-being and healing, and then encountering all these colonial frameworks and restrictions around how they can legally engage with their sacred traditional medicine, and then the psychedelic movement coming in and threatening things and triggering all the historical trauma. And then the state of the world. It's hard and it gets really overwhelming sometimes. But I think one thing that this process has shown me, as easy as it is to get overwhelmed by not only the all the research and what we're dealing with, but in just how we can make a difference. I'm going to use a cliche, which is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so I really feel like, if my research can just contribute a small amount, or if I can help change, one person's life, then that is enough to make a difference and to make forward progress.
And didn't you see there is another question if you'd like to take that one?
Yeah, so beyond policy changes, how can we help non-Indigenous folks who may want to shamanize use of traditional medicine understand the harms of appropriation? Well, I really hope that my research can do that. So I'll be speaking at Psychedelic Science next month in Denver, which is the MAPS conference. And for those who don't know, MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and they are kind of the leader of the psychedelic movement. It's a nonprofit that's been doing this work for 30 some years to try and get psychedelic assisted therapy legalized. And I'm going to present some of these research findings there. And I really intend to keep trying to educate non-Indigenous people about the historical context, about the need to acknowledge the past. Some of my former work and even my master's research talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Um, Over the years, working at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, I learned about transitional justice, which is a different framework that evolved out of the TRC process, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission framework. And transitional justice has a couple added pieces to it. It says for there to be true justice and for things to actually change and transform for the better, there not only needs to be an acknowledgement of the harms that were done, but there needs to be a change of the systems that allowed those harms to take place, as well as a promise not to repeat them. And I just think that's the basic message that I'm going out there with, with this research, is to say we have not done that yet. In fact, the psychedelic movement is just perpetuating those colonial systems and those harms. And I think the conversations that I had with other Native people before doing this research was, we saw it, we felt it, we lived it. And of course, because of, colonialism and empirical science, I had to go do research to prove it. So now I have the proof. And now I'm going to shout it from the rooftops. Say, hey, stop harming us, stop traumatizing us. Mm. I see another question. So this question says, I've noticed at various conferences, there is a large group that uses marijuana as a traditional sacred medicine. Do you see the two movements joining together to create stronger advocacy? Well, that's a complicated thing. And I actually did not I did not include that in my research project. However, I have been doing some reading about medicalized marijuana, and I do know that a lot of the states that had legalized marijuana are using that knowledge to help legalize other plant medicines. And so, in fact, I was at a conference last year where somebody spoke about psychoactive substances, and they included marijuana as a psychoactive, not as a psychedelic. Um, and so there is research that has been done, but not enough. And I think more research is needed. I think that the marijuana movement and the psychedelic movement are definitely connected in certain ways, and that there can be lessons learned from the former, but that there might be areas of separation. So, but that wasn't part of my research. Those are just my other personal opinions and non-academic research into marijuana.
I'll ask a question while we wait for additional Q&A from the audience. Great presentation, and it was a really great dissertation to read. Thank you so much for doing this work. I had a question about, given that you were traveling all over the country and, peyote grows in the Southwest, and then you're also talking to people that are in areas that don't have that. So I'm wondering if you noticed any kind of regional differences in some of your themes.
Yes. Yes, there were regional differences, and for the protection of participants, I didn't ask their exact tribal affiliation. What I asked was their cultural affiliation. So I know that sounds like, what does that mean? So for example, I'm Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, but on my survey, I would have just answered Ojibwe, right? So it could have been Ojibwe from any number of other tribes that are Ojibwe. So there was a regional difference as well in terms of like Native American church practices, as well as cultural practices from different tribal cultures. And so there was also a difference in the area of questions that I asked about knowing the history of how peyote came to your tribe, because of the region where peyote grows, the people whose tribes homelands were closer to peyote's indigenous homelands itself had more of a direct connection to how peyote was introduced to their tribe, whereas some of the farther we got, like up into Alaska, the story of how peyote came there was very different and maybe even more recent, where some people had peyote practice in their family for generations and could trace it all the way back to when it was first introduced to US tribes, versus people who were just recently introduced to it in their own lifetime, and it was not passed down through their family or through their cultural traditions.
And it looks like there's another one from the audience too.
Oh, yes. Okay. So it says, you mentioned it's not the plant medicine that heals, it's the cultural framework that comes with it. In such a fast-paced growing industry of psychedelics, what do you think we are risking by not bringing in the indigenous cultural framework more prominently? Oh, thank you for this question. Well, we're risking a lot, really. And that's one of the things that I wish my study could have gotten into. And I'm not saying I want to go be a postdoctoral, but I think there's this part that's really fascinating that nobody's really answering very clearly, at least not that I know of, in terms of, and that's because of the extractive nature of research. But Indigenous peoples have this knowledge about how to use these medicines as spiritual vehicles, right? To enter into these spiritual realms. It's very clear these are spiritual medicines. Participants talked about the fact that they have a spirit, and that these are spiritual beings. And so, in terms of the mainstream psychedelic movement, there are some people who talk about it in the spiritual sense, and maybe those who are entering through a, new age religious framework. But the majority of the movement seems to be focused, and that's the above ground movement, the one that's talked about, in the open, seems to be focused on science to prove that these medicines can be used to treat certain mental health issues, and other things like addiction and OCD, and there's various studies that show that they have a benefit, a medical benefit, and then that is being used to justify the legalization and the furthering of psychedelic assisted therapy. But what I think is not being talked about, which is happening probably mostly in the underground, according to some of the studies that I've read, is that in the underground, where they're not dealing with these medicines in a legal, regulated therapy framework or a scientific study, it's just people doing them on their own. They're either doing them recreationally or they're doing them as part of some kind of ceremony. And that's really where we need to incorporate Indigenous people's knowledge. And some of the legal programs, like Colorado's natural medicine program, and some of the training programs that are training people to facilitate these in the legal regulated models, are addressing Indigenous people's knowledge, also making room for people who've been trained in their Indigenous culture to be a traditional practitioner, to come into these regulated frameworks and not have to go through the same training to say, like, you've already been trained in your Indigenous community. But there's still this huge gap between, well, if this person is a medicine person in their own tribal ways, why would they enter into a regulated framework and sell their ceremony? And or if they are not Indigenous and they've gone through one of these training programs and are now going to facilitate and frame it as ceremony, there's a lot of concerns about cultural misappropriation. So pretty much at every turn, no matter how you look at it from an Indigenous perspective, there is a need for better incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, safety protocols, understanding about these are spiritual medicines. I heard some elders talking about how our tobacco was commodified, and then it turned. The spirit didn't like to be abused, and so it changed and it started to harm people. And I feel like that's a strong warning about these psychedelic medicines. And if they are mistreated, or people start to synthesize them or genetically modify them, what is that doing on a spiritual level? And that's something I'm not quite sure how science can answer that, but it's definitely a discussion that needs to be had.
And in DC, we are kind of coming up on our time limit that we need to move on to the closed session. But there are three more questions that have been posed here. Maybe choose one and or just take a quick response to each of them, and then we'll move on. And thanks for the questions, everybody. They're all, of course, very relevant here. So I'm kind of just killing time to give you a chance to look at them here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, these are excellent questions, and I think um, the one about elders, I can just answer really quickly. The elders that participated, of course, they thought this was important work. Some of them were, in their traditional ceremonial ways with peyote, and thought this was important, and others weren't working with peyote, but also thought this was good. So the feedback I got from elders was positive. And this one about effective ways of ensuring cultural integrity, that's a big question, but I would like to quickly try to answer the last one about the opportunity to do research in Mexico. I forgot to mention, and this will be, in the written part of the dissertation, but my IRB did not allow me to include Indigenous people outside of the United States because of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act only applying to protections for peyote, which is a controlled substance for members of tribes and so Alaska Natives and American Indians. I couldn't include people from Canada or Mexico, which originally I was going to include and do comparison because we know that the peyote also grows in Mexico, and some Native American church members are all the way up in Canada too. So I think, so I wasn't able to do that in this research round, but I think that's definitely something that could be further research that I forgot to list on my slide. And in fact, is another area that has a lot of sensitive issues in terms of people who are indigenous to Mexico who might be living in the United States, but because they're not part of the federally recognized tribal system, are not protected the same way under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. I did have some questions about that research participants answered in my study. But I think it would also be interesting to just look at how the Mexican laws treat peyote and what's going on the other side of the colonial border in terms of peyote traditions and cultural survival.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience too. Before I end this section, though, I should ask the committee members if there's anyone who wants to say or ask anything else in the public sphere here before we move into the private portion. Okay, with that, we'll move on. And Christine, please feel free to say some closing comments if you'd like for the audience.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We're recording this, and so we'll share it if people who weren't able to attend. And go ahead and follow me on Instagram, email me, or reach out to me on my website to stay updated with my research and find out when I get to publish this and share more of my research results. Chi miigwech, thank you.